Now, the Namibia Institute of Corporate Governance is a non-profit member-based association which was established in 2016. The professional body has a common place to develop skills and compare practices with the unlimited aim of encouraging a high-level corporate governance culture in Namibia. I am now joined by Executive Director Vincia Cloete with the Chairperson Steve Galloway to engage us on the upcoming Corporate Governance Conference that is taking place this week. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you so much for being here.
Morning, Alago.
Good morning.
All right. I'll start with you, Mr. Galloway. Not forgetting that we obviously have a, large viewership and maybe somebody is unfamiliar with the term corporate governance. So could you please help us understand what it means?
Sure. Let me start by saying that corporate governance is actually a misnomer. And that's why it's been so narrowly focused and a lot of people don't know about it. But it really is the governance of organizations. Any organization, any governing body of a church, a school, a corporate, big or small, an SME, a state enterprise, a public institution, all of them have governing bodies. And the way those governing bodies run the organization is really what we mean by corporate governance.
Thank you so much for that definition. Now, how would you describe the governance of organizations in Namibia?
Yeah, I've been asked this because I've been around for a long time.
Okay.
And I can give you a view on since independence. And one must always be fair in judging corporate governance, in this case, fairly. And it's a concept that has changed quite rapidly in the last 37 years.
Okay.
So when we got independence in 1990, the prevailing view on corporate governance was that enterprises, and this was the famous view by Milton Friedman, the famous economist, was that the only responsibility enterprise has to society is to maximize profit. And that was the context that we found our independence. Thankfully, we had companies that didn't believe in that and companies that really wanted to embed themselves in the economy and the social fabric of the economy. So we've had some good and some bad, but let me go right to 2019 when the famous Mervyn King, who's probably the foremost protagonist of corporate governance in the world. Mervyn King, we all know the King Codes. And he was in many meetings in Namibia, and in 2019 he was asked the question, what's the state of corporate governance in Namibia? And he concluded that the public sector was pretty poor, the private sector was patchy, that there were a few good companies, as I mentioned, who'd been doing very good things, and there were others who were not doing good things. So that was the sort of litmus test 4 years ago. I think we've improved, and I'd like to think that some of the improvement has been because of the Institute of Corporate Governance. So I think both in the public sector and in the private sector, we're moving to better governance in general.
Okay, now staying on the aspect, of Namibia and focusing on our country to be specific. Now we understand that corporate governance here is guided by the governance code, also referred to as the NAM code. So how can we then enhance, that is accountability and transparency within the corporate governance in the country?
Okay. So you looked at me, so I'm just going to take this one. Yes. You mentioned that we largely governed in a strict sense of word by the NAM code, and it is so. We have adopted the NAM code largely in Namibia, but there's been a shift towards adopting the KIM 4, which is a more progressive code in the view of the Namibia Institute of Corporate Governance, at least. And a lot of entities have, latched onto following the principles and the tenets of KIM 4 rather than the very varied and many principles of the NAM code. Not to say that the NAM code is any less better than KIM 4, but obviously the KIM 4 is based on outcomes-based governance. And so, in its progressive nature, organizations find that it is a more, applicable code in the entities and so on. So when we speak about enhancing accountability and transparency, and you are, pegging it with the principles of corporate governance on the NAM code and the KIM 4, for instance, we first have to remember that these codes are voluntary codes, but that the implementation or even the adoption of the codes really goes down to the definition of governance, as it were, in the King 4, which goes beyond sets of rules and practices and goes into really leadership. So ethical leadership, and when one looks at that definition, which is more wider than the narrow definition as it were traditionally, then you can start to see that people are able to go into aspects of integrated reporting, for instance, and this is one of the ways that we can increase accountability and transparency. So accountability, I would say, is the one part, transparency being the other part. Transparency, then I would say link it to the integrated reporting and just reporting to the stakeholders and so on. But accountability is something that I think is it's more innate. Of course, it's backended by like the code, for instance, which is some of the parts of the code are embedded in the Companies Act. So then it becomes more compulsory to apply. And then there are aspects of the code that have become common law because of the application over the years and because of reference by the courts as a code of good standard. So I think the implementation of each code really is about that innate application as a person and just leading as an ethical leader. Yeah.
I want us to remain on that implementation aspect, Mr. Galloway. Yeah. So what are the key steps then in order to enable good governance or corporate governance?
So Vince has talked about the codes, and I'll come back to those. Yeah. But I think our sort of core foundation is given to us in the Harambee Prosperity Plan. You know, we've been doing codes for a while, but the Harambee Prosperity Plan and the NDPs, the National Development Plans, the last one was 5, 6 is coming up. They have as an absolute fundamental pillar governance. And one of the things that they refer to as a priority is the accountability and transparency in public institutions, this is, but that applies to everybody, of course. And they require a culture of structured and accurate reporting in the public sector. The question we'll be asking at the conference is, has that really happened? We're halfway through Harambee 2. We finished NDP 5. We're about to embark on NDP 6. The question we'll be asking is, have we really done what the Harambee Prosperity Plan has asked us to do? Then we move on to the codes, NAM code, we've talked about King 4. But it really is about doing the right thing. Yeah. And most people know what the right thing is in their context. And if we do that, then we're certainly going to enhance transparency, accountability, and really take our roles as directors or governing trustees or directors of all these organizations that we talk about. And it's that accountability, personal accountability, that we're talking about.
Now, Ms. Cloete, I want us to talk about, this upcoming conference that will be taking place from the 16th to the 17th of March, that is this week, and at the Vincia Country Club. Now, we understand that the theme for this event is Mindshift, Real Contextualized Sustainability for Namibia. Please explain this theme to us.
So really the theme is aimed at contextualizing the wider issues of ESG within the socio-economic, legal, geopolitical landscape of Namibia, rather than arbitrarily applying global tenets and global standards to Namibia. So what we're saying with the conference and the theme, you can see it's contextualized and it's sustainability and it's mind shift. I think those are the buzzwords for us. And when we discuss the topics and the themes around the conference, we want to make sure that we are contextualizing within the landscape of Namibia, rather than just pulling and extracting codes and practices and standards globally applicable and just plugging it onto Namibia without contextualizing. I think that's a legal theme generally, that when there is an international convention or international law, you want to contextualize it, you want to bring it within the context of Namibia to apply appropriately. So that's what we want to ensure with the conference, number one. And number two, we want to ensure that this application is sustainable, that everything that we will be discussing within the ESG framework, and Steve has mentioned the Harambee Prosperity Plan, the NDCs, the SDGs, and so on, within the context of all of that, we want to make sure that these plans that we're making, or the codes that we're applying, the standards that we're trying to apply, the ESG templates that we might come up with are all not just contextualized, but that they are sustainable for Namibia and for generations to come. And that's the discussions that we want to have. The other thing that I mentioned just now is its mind shift. We want to get to a place where we want to challenge how we think about governance and how we think about ESG, for instance, and it's an emerging and a trending concept in the moment. And we want to get to a place where we're thinking not conventionally, but out of the box, and that we're shifting our thinking from that conventional thinking to a place where we challenge ourselves, first of all, and we challenge each other, even on a leadership scale, to say, are we doing the right things, and how can we get to a place that we do better within Namibia, for Namibia, and for the people of Namibia. Yeah.
Now, let's talk briefly about some of the topics that will be, addressed at this conference. Of course, we understand that there will be plenty, there will be more, there will be many. But because of time, can we just perhaps touch on the most critical topics that, will be discussed at the conference?
I don't want to say that the one is more critical than the other, because the three, when you speak about ESG, which will be the overarching theme of the conference, is that you cannot have environment, which is the E of ESG, without society, and vice versa, but the two should be underpinned by governance. So every area, the E, the S, and the G, has very important aspects that we're going to discuss. And maybe I should just take one from each.
Okay.
And say under the E, we're going to discuss the governance of natural resources. And under there, we're definitely going to discuss themes like just energy transition. And I just heard the conversation that happened before us they were talking about climate change and so on. These are the topics that we're going to unpack at this conference. And I think that, if we're going to affect or impact the environment in Namibia, and there was decarbonization topics and so on, hydrogen, all of that is coming up on our agenda as a discussion point, and we want to really hone into these areas, see how applicable they are to Namibia and how they can be contextualized within Namibia. And on that, for instance, the Minister of Mines and Energy is the keynote speaker. You can imagine that you cannot speak about governance of natural resources without the ministry being involved. And on the society, we want to speak about governance of state asset, which I think is a key issue, because you cannot impact the society without governing the assets well, and that speaks to public entities. But public entities can only do so far or so much if the private entities and the private sector is dormant. Then there's only so much that the public entities can do. So the convergence between the two, how they can collaborate to impact CSI in Namibia, that's a big topic that we're also going to have. We're hoping that the Ministry of Finance and Public Enterprises will be there. They are also represented by the Deputy ED, who will also be on our panels speaking about governance of state resources and state assets. Okay. Then we go lastly to governance, where we'll be speaking about issues like transparency, whistleblowing, corruption, greenwashing, and so on. And I don't think we have enough time to go into each, but it will be important for people to attend the conference to see that it's a loaded program, and it will be unpacked in a very systematic way, in very wise ways, and so on.
All right. Now, please share with us your final remarks, Mr. Galloway.
Sure. I really appeal to everybody to come to this conference, or at least to dial in. I think it's the most significant governance conference that's happened in this country ever. And that's quite a statement. I think governance has moved so fast that we really are at the leading edge now, at the cutting edge of governance. And I think if we really have all parties, and that we've done, Vincia has done an amazing job with her team in getting public sector, civil society, private sector, and the real decision makers into one forum. And I really do believe that collectively we can come up with a model for governance, for ESG, that is going to take this country into a very, very positive space in the next few years.
Thank you both for being here and all the best with the conference.
Thank you so much.
All right. Well, that was Vincia Cloete as well as Steve Galloway, and they are from the Namibia Institute of Corporate Governance, talking to us about the conference that will take place this week. We will be back with the news. Stay tuned.